For most of modern history, cash was not something you had to explain. You earned it, you spent it, and the transaction ended there. No follow-up questions. No alerts. No flags. If you paid in banknotes, the deal was complete the moment the money changed hands. That simplicity was not seen as a flaw. It was a point. Today, that same simplicity is treated with suspicion. Walk into a bank with a large amount of cash, and you are likely to be asked where it came from. Try to pay cash for certain goods, and you may be refused outright. In many cities, signs saying card only or no cash accepted are now common, even in places where cash is still legal tender. The shift happened quietly, but the message is clear. Using cash now places you closer to the edge of legitimacy than the center of normal economic life. This change did not happen because cash suddenly became inefficient. In many situations, cash is still faster than digital payments, works without electricity or internet, and settles instantly without intermediaries. Nor did it happen because people stopped trusting physical money. In crises, trust in cash often increases, not decreases. During blackouts, system outages, or banking disruptions, cash becomes a fallback. If anything, cash has proven remarkably resilient. The real turning point was not technological progress, but a change in how governments and financial institutions think about risk. After the late 20th century, and especially after major geopolitical shocks, the definition of financial risk expanded. Money was no longer just a medium of exchange. It became a potential threat vector. Terrorist financing, organized crime, tax evasion, and later large-scale money laundering scandals reframed the conversation. Cash, because it does not automatically create records, became the easiest symbol of what could not be seen. Following major terrorist attacks in the early 2000s, many countries passed laws aimed at tracing the flow of money. International frameworks, such as anti-money-laundering (AML) and Know Your Customer (KYC) rules were strengthened and standardized. Banks were required to identify customers, monitor transactions, and report suspicious activity. None of this targeted cash explicitly at first. The focus was on preventing large, illicit financial networks from operating invisibly. But as these systems expanded, cash stood out as an anomaly. Digital transactions generate data by default: who paid whom, when, where, and for what amount. Cash does not. From the perspective of a system designed to map flows and patterns, cash creates blank spaces. Those blank spaces became uncomfortable. Gradually, the language around cash began to change. It was no longer described as neutral or private, but as untraceable. That word matters. Untraceable implies danger, even if no crime has occurred. The absence of data started to be framed as a risk in itself. This is how a lawful object begins to resemble evidence, not because it proves wrongdoing, but because it cannot prove innocence through records. The suspicion became institutionalized through thresholds and reporting requirements. In many countries, cash transactions above a certain amount must be reported to authorities. Depositing or withdrawing large sums can trigger automatic scrutiny. Businesses dealing heavily in cash are classified as high risk and subjected to extra compliance burdens. These measures are often justified with statistics about crime and evasion, but their effect is broader. They redefine normal behavior. What once required a warrant now happens by default. Banks are no longer passive custodians of money. They are active gatekeepers. They are expected to ask questions, to interpret intent, and to escalate concerns. Cash transactions force them into this role because cash arrives without context. A digital transfer comes with metadata. Cash arrives as a physical fact that demands explanation. Over time, this has reshaped public perception. People internalize the idea that using cash is something that needs justification. If you pay digitally, no one asks why. If you pay in cash, the question lingers, even if unspoken. The act itself becomes unusual. This is not because the law changed overnight, but because norms did. Importantly, this suspicion does not require proof of widespread abuse to function. It operates on precaution. The argument is simple: because cash could be used for illegal purposes, it should be discouraged or tightly controlled. But this logic is asymmetrical. Many tools can be misused, yet remain accepted because their misuse is harder to generalize. Cash is different because it resists monitoring at scale. This resistance is often misinterpreted as hostility to order. In reality, cash simply enforces a boundary. It limits how much information a transaction reveals beyond the transaction itself. That boundary once aligned with everyday expectations of privacy. Today, It conflicts with systems built around continuous observation. The result is a subtle inversion. Digital payments, which require infrastructure, permissions, and intermediaries, are framed as safe and normal. Cash, which requires none of these, is framed as risky. The standard has flipped. Transparency is no longer about fairness or clarity. It is about traceability. This is why cash is increasingly treated like a crime scene. Not because a crime has occurred, but because investigators prefer environments where every movement leaves a trace. In such an environment, anything that does not record itself feels out of place. Cash is silent. Silence, in a data-driven system, is suspicious. Yet it is worth noting what is lost in this reframing. Cash transactions end. They do not linger in databases. They do not get reanalyzed years later under new rules or new political priorities. They do not expose networks of association beyond the immediate exchange. For decades, this finality was considered a feature of economic freedom. When that feature is reclassified as a flaw, it signals a deeper shift. The question is no longer whether cash is efficient or outdated. The question is whether a system that expects total visibility can tolerate instruments that operate outside its field of vision. By the time cash is openly restricted, the groundwork has already been laid. The public has been conditioned to see it as abnormal, risky, and vaguely illicit. No dramatic ban is required. Social pressure and institutional friction do most of the work. This is how cash moved from being the default to being the exception, not through a single law or conspiracy, but through a gradual alignment of incentives, fears, and technologies. Once money became inseparable from data, anything that carried value without data became suspect. And in that world, cash does not look like a payment method anymore. It looks like evidence waiting to be explained. To understand why cash became such a problem for modern systems, it helps to stop thinking about money as money. In contemporary finance, money is no longer just a unit of value or a means of exchange. It is also a stream of information. Every digital transaction produces data, identities, timestamps, locations, categories, and behavioral patterns. This data is not a byproduct. It is central to how the system functions. Banks, payment networks, and regulators do not merely move funds from one account to another. They analyze flows, detect anomalies, score risk, and predict behavior. Credit decisions, fraud detection, compliance checks, and even monetary policy increasingly rely on transaction data. In this environment, money that does not generate data is not neutral. It is disruptive. Cash breaks the system in three fundamental ways. First, cash does not create an automatic record. When a card is used or a transfer is made, the system instantly knows who sent money, who received it, how much, when it happened, and often why it happened. Merchant codes, transaction notes, and linked accounts provide context. Cash provides none of this. Once it leaves one hand and enters another, the system goes blind. There is no log, no trail, no database entry. For institutions built around monitoring and reporting, this absence is not just inconvenient, it is structurally incompatible. Second, cash transactions are final in a way digital transactions are not. Digital payments can be frozen, reversed, delayed, or recalled. Funds can be locked while a review is conducted. Accounts can be suspended pending investigation. These features are presented as consumer protection and risk management tools, and sometimes they are, but they also give institutions leverage. Cash offers no such leverage. Once a cash transaction occurs, it cannot be paused or undone. There is no intermediary to appeal to and no mechanism to retroactively impose conditions. From a control perspective, this is unacceptable friction. Third, cash resists behavioral classification. Modern financial systems do not only care about how much money moves, but how it moves. Patterns matter. Regularity matters. Deviations matter. Digital transactions allow systems to build profiles, spending habits, income stability, lifestyle indicators. These profiles are used to assign trust, limits, and access. Cash transactions collapse all of this nuance. A cash payment for food looks identical to a cash payment for anything else. The system cannot tell the difference, and that uncertainty is treated as risk. These three properties, lack of traceability, irreversibility, and behavioral opacity, are precisely what made cash acceptable for everyday life in the past. They allowed transactions to remain local, contextual, and finite. But in a system optimized for centralized oversight, they are flaws. This is why regulatory frameworks focus so heavily on cash, even when the stated goals are broader. Anti-money laundering rules, for example, do not ban cash, but they surround it with conditions. Reporting thresholds, source of funds questions, enhanced due diligence for cash-heavy businesses, all of these are attempts to retrofit data onto something that naturally resists it. Consider how this works in practice. When a large digital transfer occurs, the system already has context. It knows the account history, counterparties, and typical behavior. When a large amount of cash appears, none of that context exists. The burden of explanation shifts to the individual. Where did this come from? Why now? What is it for? The transaction itself is treated as incomplete until it is accompanied by a narrative. This reversal is subtle but important. In a data-centric system, legitimacy flows from records. If an action is logged, categorized, and fits expected patterns, it is presumed acceptable. If it lacks records, it becomes suspect, regardless of whether it is legal. Cash forces people to justify themselves in a way digital transactions do not. The economic justification often given is efficiency and security. Digital systems are said to reduce crime, lower costs, and improve transparency. There is truth to some of these claims. Certain forms of large-scale fraud are harder to conduct without leaving traces. But this argument often ignores a key point. Digital systems do not eliminate risk. They relocate it. Fraud does not disappear. It adapts. Cybercrime, identity theft, and system exploitation have grown alongside digital finance. The difference is that these risks are managed through centralized mechanisms. When something goes wrong digitally, institutions intervene. When something goes wrong with cash, there is no such safety net. From an institutional perspective, centralized risks are preferable because they can be governed. This preference reveals the real issue. Cash is not dangerous because it enables crime. Digital systems enable crime too. Cash is problematic because it operates outside the system's ability to observe, intervene, and optimize. It represents a domain where outcomes cannot be predicted or shaped through data. As finance became more intertwined with governance, this intolerance for opacity intensified. Governments rely on financial data to enforce tax compliance, sanctions, and economic policy. Payment networks rely on it to manage liability and reputation. Banks rely on it to meet regulatory obligations. In all cases, visibility is not optional. It is foundational. Cash disrupts this foundation. It allows economic activity to occur without immediate inclusion in national accounts, risk models, or surveillance frameworks. Even when used for entirely lawful purposes, it creates statistical noise. For planners and regulators who aim to see the whole system at once, this noise is unacceptable. This is why the pressure against cash often comes indirectly, instead of banning it outright. Systems make it inconvenient. Limits are imposed. Fees are added. Access points are reduced. Businesses are discouraged from accepting it. Over time, usage declines not because people dislike cash, but because using it requires swimming against the current. Crucially, this shift is often framed as progress. More data is equated with better outcomes. More traceability is equated with fairness. But these equations are not neutral. They embed assumptions about who should see, who should decide, and who should be trusted. When money becomes inseparable from data, participation in the economy increasingly requires consent to observation. Cash offers an alternative, participation, without continuous disclosure. That alternative undermines systems designed to manage behavior through information. This is why cash feels out of place in the modern financial architecture. It is not aligned with the logic of optimization, prediction, and control. It does not feed the models. It does not improve the dashboards. It simply works quietly without asking permission. In a world where financial order depends on knowing as much as possible about every transaction, that quietness is unsettling. Cash exposes a limit, a point beyond which the system cannot see. And systems built on visibility tend to treat limits not as boundaries to respect, but as problems to solve. Once cash was reframed as a risk to be managed, the next step followed naturally: expand the definition of risk itself. What began as an effort to stop specific crimes gradually turned into a system for shaping acceptable financial behavior. The shift did not happen through a single decision. It emerged through policy language, compliance culture, and the incentives placed on institutions. The justification was always reasonable on the surface. Government spoke about fighting money laundering, terrorism financing, and organized crime. Regulators emphasized systemic stability. Banks talked about protecting customers and maintaining trust. Each layer sounded defensive, not aggressive. But taken together, They produced a system in which neutrality disappeared. At first, controls focus on extremes. Large sums, unusual movements, cross-border transfers. Most ordinary people were unaffected. This created a sense that compliance rules were about other people, not everyday life. But modern financial systems do not scale by exception. They scale by automation. Once monitoring is automated, it is cheaper to watch everything than to decide what not to watch. As automation spread, the focus shifted from transactions to patterns. It was no longer enough to know that money moved. The system wanted to know whether the movement made sense. Did it match past behavior? Did it align with peer groups? Did it fit expected profiles? Risk became statistical rather than contextual. This is where cash becomes especially problematic. Cash does not generate the kind of continuous signal that pattern-based systems rely on. It interrupts behavioral timelines. From the system's perspective, a person who regularly uses digital payments, suddenly withdrawing or spending cash looks anomalous. Anomaly in risk models is not neutral. It is something to be investigated. The language used to describe this process is revealing. Banks do not say they are judging customers. They say they are managing exposure. Accounts are not punished. They are off-boarded. Transactions are not blocked. They are paused pending review. These terms soften reality, but the effect is the same. Access to financial infrastructure becomes conditional. Importantly, these conditions are often opaque. When an account is restricted or closed, explanations are minimal or non-existent. This is not always malicious. In many jurisdictions, institutions are legally discouraged from explaining compliance actions to avoid tipping off potential criminals. But this creates an asymmetry of power. The system can act decisively while the individual is left guessing. Cash usage intensifies this asymmetry. Because cash arrives without built-in context, it increases the likelihood that a bank will seek explanations. Even when those explanations are legitimate, they must fit predefined categories. Income that does not align neatly with standard employment models, freelance work, informal labor, gifts, savings held outside the banking system becomes harder to defend. Over time, this dynamic shifts behavior. People learn, often unconsciously, to adjust their actions to avoid friction. They choose payment methods that leave clean, predictable trails. They avoid transactions that might look unusual. They self-censor financially. This is not the result of coercion in the traditional sense, but of incentives and penalties built into the system. The original goal of preventing serious crime fades into the background. What remains is a structure that rewards conformity. The safest customer is not the most honest one, but the most legible one. Legibility becomes a proxy for trust. This has consequences beyond banking. When financial access is conditional, it becomes a tool of enforcement. Sanctions regimes rely on payment controls. Emergency powers rely on account freezes. During periods of unrest or crisis, the ability to restrict financial activity becomes a lever of governance. These measures are often justified as temporary and exceptional, but history shows that temporary financial controls have a habit of persisting. Cash complicates this model because it weakens enforcement at the individual level. A person with cash retains the ability to transact even when digitally excluded. This is not inherently subversive, but it limits the reach of policy tools. From the perspective of authorities and institutions, this limitation appears as a vulnerability. The framing then shifts again. Cash is no longer just a risk factor. It is a loophole. And loopholes in regulatory thinking are meant to be closed. The more behavior is managed through financial channels, the more intolerable off-channel activity becomes. This is why cash-heavy sectors face disproportionate scrutiny. Restaurants, small retailers, street vendors, and informal services are often subjected to assumptions of non-compliance, even when they operate legally. The issue is not evidence of wrongdoing, but difficulty of measurement. What cannot be easily measured is harder to govern. The transformation is subtle but profound. Money, once a neutral medium, becomes a mechanism of alignment. Spending choices, income sources, and even personal associations are filtered through compliance logic. Financial institutions become intermediaries not just of payments, but of norms. In this environment, cash stands out as a refusal to participate fully in behavioral monitoring. Not a rebellion, but a limit. It allows people to operate without constantly signaling who they are, what they do, and whether they fit expected patterns. That is why the pressure against cash escalates even when crime statistics do not demand it. The objective is not simply to stop illegal activity, but to reduce uncertainty. A system that governs through data seeks to minimize spaces where data is absent. By the time cash is portrayed as socially irresponsible or suspicious, the shift is complete. The conversation is no longer about specific harms. It is about compliance as a way of life. And in that context, cash is inconvenient, not because it is criminal, but because it preserves a form of agency that cannot be easily scored, paused, or programmed. At this point, the question is no longer whether a cashless world is more efficient. In many ways, it is. Digital payments reduce friction, enable instant settlement, and integrate seamlessly with global systems. The real question is different. When money becomes fully dependent on permissioned infrastructure, who ultimately holds power over participation? A world without cash does not remove money from people's lives. It removes the option to operate outside approved channels. Every transaction must pass through an intermediary. Every payment must comply with rules that can change, sometimes quickly, sometimes retroactively. Convenience comes bundled with conditional access. This is often framed as a reasonable trade-off. If you follow the rules, you have nothing to worry about. But this framing assumes that rules are static, fairly applied, and transparent. In practice, they are none of these things. Financial rules evolve with political priorities, economic pressures, and technological capabilities. What is acceptable today may be flagged tomorrow. What is harmless in one context may become problematic in another. Cash provides insulation against this instability. It does not guarantee safety or fairness, but it does guarantee independence from real-time permission. When you hold cash, you are not subject to automated reviews, risk scores, or behavioral flags. You are not required to explain intent before acting. That independence is precisely what makes cash uncomfortable for centralized systems. In a fully digital environment, exclusion becomes easy. Accounts can be frozen with a few keystrokes. Payment privileges can be revoked without physical confrontation or public process. These actions can be justified as technical, procedural, or temporary. But for the person affected, the impact is immediate and total. Without access to the payment system, everyday life becomes difficult very quickly. Supporters of cashless systems often argue that safeguards exist: appeals processes, consumer protections, oversight mechanisms. And it is true that these exist on paper. But they are slow, opaque, and asymmetrical. Institutions can act instantly. Individuals must react within structures they do not control. Cash shifts this balance, even if only slightly, by giving individuals a fallback. This fallback does not threaten society. It threatens monopoly over enforcement. When financial control becomes a primary tool of governance, any means of transacting beyond that control appears as a weakness. The goal then becomes not to ban cash outright, but to make it marginal, rare, inconvenient, socially discouraged. Notice how this plays out. Cash is associated with suspicion, inefficiency, and backwardness. Digital payments are associated with progress, safety, and responsibility. The moral dimension is subtle but powerful. People begin to see cash users not just as old-fashioned, but as questionable. The stigma does the work that laws do not need to. Yet history suggests caution. Systems designed for total visibility tend to be brittle. They work well under normal conditions but struggle under stress. Outages, cyber attacks, political upheaval, and policy errors can propagate quickly when everything is connected. Cash, precisely because it is simple and decentralized, absorbs shock rather than amplifying it. More importantly, cash preserves a principle that predates modern finance: the idea that not every action needs to be recorded to be legitimate. That privacy is not secrecy. That autonomy is not criminality. These ideas are increasingly out of step with data-driven governance, but that does not make them obsolete. A cashless society does not automatically become authoritarian, but it does lower the cost of authoritarian measures. It makes them easier to implement, harder to evade, and simpler to justify. The infrastructure built for efficiency can be repurposed for control without significant modification. This is why debates about cash often feel disproportionate. The amounts involved are small. The users are ordinary, yet the pressure is relentless. The issue is not revenue loss or crime prevention alone. It is about closing the last gaps where individuals can act without being continuously evaluated. Cash represents a choice, the choice to transact without asking, without logging, without leaving a permanent trace. As long as that choice exists, participation in the financial system is not entirely conditional. Once it disappears, money becomes something you're allowed to use, not something you simply have. That is the quiet tension beneath the discussion. Cash is not being phased out because it no longer works. It is being phased out because it still does. It still allows economic life to function without oversight, scoring, or approval. In a world built on visibility, that is not just inconvenient, it is unacceptable. And that is why cash is treated like a crime scene, not because it proves guilt, but because it preserves a space where innocence does not need to be documented.